Yeah. So, James, the Epistle of James, written apparently between 40 AD and 60 AD. Not that that's massively important, but that's what it says here. So, James is a highly controversial book. I don't know if you know this, but there were times when James was really in danger of being, people wanted to throw it out of the Bible, particularly during the time of the Reformation, for a whole number of reasons. Mainly because I think James deals with good works, good deeds, and at the time of the Reformation, the cry was sola fide, faith alone. And salvation was by faith. That was the big discovery that they made, of course, through Martin Luther, that it's by faith are you saved. And so they look at a book like James and think, well, what do we do with this book? It's all about good works. And also because the Roman Catholic Church had used the Epistle of James, or rather misused it, to try and convince people that salvation was by works. And so they kind of perverted the words of James and tried to use it to get people to give indulgences and give money to the church and all the rest of it, and say, oh, by your good works you'll be justified before God. And so the book of James kind of fell into ill favour, even with Luther calling it an epistle of straw, and people saying it shouldn't be in the Bible. So it almost came to that point where people were saying, what do we do with this book? Another reason is because, in Galatians 2:12, it talks about certain men came from James, and they were Judaizers. And the arguments have gone on, people saying, well, it's a different James, it's not the same James. So many different people called James in the Bible: James, son of Alphaeus, James, son of Zebedee, James, the Lord Jesus' brother. And so there'd been arguments over which particular James it was. And also we might add, just because certain men came from James doesn't necessarily mean that James sent them out and told them to preach this message of submitting to the law of Moses. It could just be a term. People have argued that James was the bishop of Jerusalem, so they'd come from there. And so there's all different sorts of arguments going around, which I don't really want to get into because even now they've not been properly resolved. But I would say this, that I think it shows, and I've even spoken to people who profess to be Christians today, who say, I don't like James, because they feel it somehow undermines the epistles like Romans and Galatians that Paul wrote. But I think it's the perfect balance to the book of Galatians, which we just recently studied, because it now deals with good works, it deals with good deeds, and says, where are they to be placed in a Christian's life? Where do we place them in our doctrines? And what I thought was really interesting was reading what William Tyndale had to say about it, because of course he was there, he was in the Reformation, he was aware of all the arguments, he was aware of how the Roman Catholic Church had used the Epistle of James, and he gives a really good insight. If you've got his Tyndale's New Testament and you look in the prologue to James, I think it says the prologue to James and Jude actually, but he gives some absolutely brilliant insights into the themes that run through the book of James. And I'm just going to read to you actually some of the things that he says, because I think they'll just make it really clear, and I think we should bear these in mind as we go through James. He says this, talking about Abraham, who of course is mentioned in James. Abraham was not justified by works before God, but by faith only. And he cites Romans 4, we might also cite Romans 3, verse 28, that a man is justified by faith, not by the works of the law. And he goes on to say, but deeds only justified him, Abraham, before the world. Faith did cause him to work the will of God outwardly, whereby he was righteous before the world, and whereby the world perceived that he believed in God, loved and feared God. So he's saying justification before God is only ever by faith. It's not by anything else, it's by faith. But justification before the world is by works. And you may say, well, why do we need to be justified before the world? But we were reading in the Gospel of John 8:46 it is. Jesus says to the Pharisees, which of you convicts me of sin? Saying looking to the Pharisees, saying, look at my life, look at the things I've done. Can you convict me of any sin? No. Even though they may lie, and in that sort of same chapter, he talks about their father, the devil, who's the father of lies. They may lie, but they cannot legitimately accuse Jesus of any sin. Therefore, Jesus stands justified before them by his good works, his good deeds, the things that he has done. We might also remember 1 Timothy 3:16, where it talks about God being made manifest in the flesh, and talks about him being justified before the world, justified by the Spirit. How? Because he was raised from the dead by the power of the Spirit, which showed that he was a good person, that he wasn't a sinner, and also because of the miracles that he did. It was a justification before the whole world that God had come. And so being justified before the world is important. Also because the Bible talks about avoid even the appearance of evil. So like Paul could say, you have observed my life, my conduct. So this is really important. Works justify us before the world, but they do not justify us before God. It's not even faith plus works justifying us before God, but it is faith justifying us before God, and works justifying us before the world. Together justify us completely, as it were. That's my understanding of what James is saying here in this book, because we'll come across some verses later on in various chapters, and if you're not aware of that, you'll think, hang on, what's this? This is a contradiction to what Paul says in Romans. It's a contradiction to what he says in other epistles, but it's not. It's the perfect companion with those books to get a real balanced view of the Christian life.